This film is the second in the series of illustrations of military history based upon the core Cuneo paintings hanging in the headquarter mess. We move from the North African campaign of 1942 to the winter of 1943-1944 and to Italy. This painting depicts the building of a Bailey bridge over the river Rapido as a prelude to the capturing of the town and monastery at Cassino. The battles for Cassino were far from easy, and it took 4 attempts before the Allies were able to pass on into Rome. Italy lends itself well to defence. Down the greater part of its length runs a central backbone of mountains, some as high as 2,000 metres, and from this branch a succession of mountain ribs, making movement extremely difficult off the main roads. No sooner had one river or mountain been crossed than another appeared. Every 500 metres there was a new defensive position for a company, and every 5 miles a new natural line for a division. After the great victory in North Africa, the British High Command considered that the momentum must be maintained in the period up to the planned invasion across the Channel in 1944, and Italy seemed the ideal place for this. It was the soft underbelly of the Axis, and it appeared at that time to be the easiest and the most direct way into Europe. A successful invasion would give the Allied neighbours the important ports of Naples and Taranto, and the air forces the extensive Foggia airfields from which the air offensive against Central Europe could be strengthened. And the capture of Rome would be psychologically and morally of great importance. But above all else, it was essential to the success of the cross-channel invasion to divert and to destroy as many of the German divisions as possible. The campaign started with landings in Sicily in July 1943, but as this was drawing to its successful conclusion, an event took place that radically changed the fortunes of the Allies for the better. On the 25th of July, Mussolini fell from power, and the new Italian order under General Badoglio continued the war, but this time on the side of the Allies. Naturally, this caused some delay, during which the Germans succeeded in disarming a number of Italian divisions. The campaign restarted in September 1943 with landings in the Straits of Messina and in the Gulf of Salerno. Initially things went well for the Allies, and the removal of about 40 divisions from the Axis partnership meant that they had to be replaced by German divisions from other fronts, thus achieving a part of the Allies' long-term objective. But the advance north came to an abrupt halt in the face of the town of Cassino, at the back of which was the dominant feature of Monte Cassino. On this mount, the monk, Benedict, founded the Benedictine order in the 6th century, and since then the Mont and the monastery have been much involved in history. The citadel on the mount stands over 500 metres and was built to grand proportions. Its longest side was more than twice the length of Buckingham Palace, and the 4-storey building was constructed as a fortress. The citadel dominated the Via Cassilia, or Highway 6, which was one of the 2 main roads leading to Rome, the other being the Via Appia, or the coastal road, now called Highway 7. As the Rock of Gibraltar commands entry into the Mediterranean, so Monte Cassino does the same into the Liri Valley, forcing the road to make a wide detour around its base, and looming over the road like a sentinel. Cassino was the perfect natural defensive position, a battleground consisting partly of mountain, partly of river and valley, and each admirably complementing the other. The ground very much shaped the battle, confining activity to a sector less than 10 miles wide, and so dominated and canalized operations that everything that happened beyond the sector became a subsidiary. And so it was here that the Germans chose to make their main defensive effort. It was here they spent numerous hours in preparation, in laying mines, in digging in tanks and guns, in tunnelling, in building pillboxes designed to withstand bombardment. And it was here that Kesselring ordered the upper reaches of the river Rapido to be dammed to cause the plain to be flooded. and it was here that the Germans massed about 25 divisions once they had assessed that the Allies were not going to make a major offensive into the Balkans. The preparations went on for 3 months, and whilst initially the monastery was not occupied, the defences went on all around it. This then was Cassino, the hard core of the defensive Gustav line, a natural mountain barrier made very much stronger by the ingenuity of the military engineers. The battles of Cassino started on the 15th of January 1944, but it took 4 months for Monte Cassino to be bypassed after 4 extremely hard-fought and bloody battles. The first battle was hastily prepared. It was really an extension of the winter offensive. Exhausted by weeks of heavy fighting, terrible weather, and heavy casualties, the troops were ill prepared for the assault. The pressure was on to bypass Cassino to link with the Anzio force designed as a diversion for Cassino, with landings scheduled a few days later. Anzio was to be subsidiary to Cassino, with the aim of splitting the German forces between 2 fronts, thus weakening each. The plan involved the crossing of the river Rapido in the north and a drive up the Liri Valley to link with the beachhead at Anzio. At the same time, pressure would come from the south. The American Texan Division splashed through the flooded meadows thickly sown with mines and suffered a calamitous 2 days. At only 20 meters wide, it was not possible to bring artillery fire onto the far bank in support of the assault crossing, and the current speed of nearly 8 knots gave treacherous conditions. To make matters worse, a thick fog surrounded the river, making direction finding extremely difficult. The approaches were soon a mass of mud, and progress became very, very slow. With banks at a vertical height of 2 to 3 feet above water level, the launching of boats became a nightmare. By the following morning, only a handful of Texans were across the river, completely cut off from the home bank. The engineers had battled all night to erect footbridges, and those that were not destroyed in the fire were soon destroyed the following morning. And orders were soon received to consolidate the position, and the following night 2 battalions managed to cross. This time, the fog helped the Allies, who tried to build a Bailey bridge to enable armoured cars to support the offensive. However, the site was well registered, and the bridge builders stood no chance at all. By 4 p.m. that day, it was all over, and the offensive was called off. The division had lost nearly 2,000 men, and they were badly shaken as a fighting force. 2 days later, the offensive was resumed on account of the need to break through to link with the Anzio force. Some initial successes were made, but the inability of the tanks to move forward over the boggy ground severely limited the support to the infantry, and the momentum slowed. Thrust after thrust continued for 2.5 weeks in a vain attempt to secure a foothold against fierce bombardment. Casualties were heavy, well over 2,000. The German Gustav line had held, and the weak points were identified and fortified by the enemy. What was needed now was a period of consolidation so that resupply routes and reinforcement could be established. However, rumours of an enemy counter-offensive against the Anzio force were strong, and the pressure to maintain the offensive was immense. Ironically, Anzio, instead of being a relief for the pressure at Cassino, had now become a liability and was now itself in need of rescue. It was clear that the Americans would not be able to hold on to their narrow foothold without much more support. So 2 new divisions were introduced, 4th Indian Division and 2nd New Zealand Division. Once again, the formations were launched into battle earlier than planned, and tank movement was limited, and aircraft could not fly because of the weather, and daylight recce was impossible on account of the dominance of Monte Cassino. What was needed was a bombardment of the citadel, as conventional weapons were having little effect. After much agonizing deliberation, the decision was taken, and on the 15th of February, a constant stream of aircraft bombed the area all day long. The result was a double-edged weapon. The citadel had been reduced to ruins, but the remains gave ideal firing positions to the Germans, who had hitherto not occupied the monastery. The approach to the monastery was dominated by ground of tactical importance, again occupied by the Germans. There was a desperate need for tanks to support the advance, but the ground conditions prevented any movement. All night long the engineers worked to bridge the gullies and to clear the minefields, but by daylight they failed to reach the station, leaving the New Zealanders completely cut off. A few hours later the battle ended with very few credits to the Allies. And once again the Gustav Line and the citadel had proved a formidable obstacle. The third battle was set for the 24th of February, giving a few days to regroup and to reorganize. But the plan depended upon 3 days of dry weather so that effective use could be made of tanks. For the last battle, the Allies had available 600 tanks and 800 artillery pieces, 500 aircraft all grounded on account of the weather, and about 70,000 wheeled vehicles. But those gains that were made were won by the infantryman moving on his feet. The plan was to be a frontal attack. However, the day before the planned battle start date, it rained and went on so for another 3 weeks. Battle eventually started on the 15th of March with a 4-hour bombardment of Cassino town itself. The plan was to bomb the town from the air, followed by an artillery bombardment, after which the infantry would close in fast. However, in spite of massive support, the weather won the day. And by midnight it started to rain, and soon everywhere was a sea of mud once again. Some successes were made, but the attack was called off when it was obvious that numbers were insufficient and the conditions were appalling. The cost to the Allies over the second and third battles was considerable. The New Zealanders had lost well over 1,600, and the Indians were virtually non-effective, having lost over 3,000 men. The Germans too had their losses, but their resistance was considerable, using some of the very best troops at their disposal. So we moved to the last Battle of Cassino, and it was here that the British sappers built their bridge. Alexander decided that the only way to overcome this heavily fortified position was to amass great numerical superiority. His plan was to pack the front with 2 armies, moving side by side on a 20-mile front between Cassino and the sea. Once the force had smashed Cassino and was advancing to Rome, the Anzio force would break out to cut off the retreating Germans. The regrouping to build up these 2 armies took 2 months and was done under strict secrecy, and a fictitious landing operation was planned to deceive the enemy. The landing was designed to deflect a number of German divisions, including reserves, so that reinforcement at Cassino would take too long to be effective. For the real offensive, much preparation work was carried out. Roads and tracks were constructed, and assault river crossings were practiced. The cover plan was effective, and on May the 11th, the battle for Cassino restarted. The 5th Army were to occupy the left flank astride Route 7, whilst the 8th Army would take the inland route astride Route 6 and push up the Liri Valley. To support these attacks, Alexander had collected some 2,000 tanks, 3,000 aircraft and 1,500 guns. The 8th Army had the more difficult and key task, which was the encirclement of Cassino, which meant crossing the Rapido and the Garigliano. The need for tanks to support the attack was vital to the success of the operation. And the need for Bailey bridging was paramount. The failure by the British divisions to cross the Rapido before daylight would give the Germans a whole day to recover, and the following night a river crossing would be much more difficult. 2300 on the 11th of May, a massive bombardment started, and after 40 minutes this lifted to a creeping barrage as the infantry advanced on the 20-mile front. In 8th Army, 4th British Division were on the right flank and 8th Indian Division on the left, and both crossed the River Rapido shortly after midnight. However, in the smoke and the fog, many of the advancing infantry lost their way to the river, and it was touch and go that the small bridgehead could be maintained. The fire intensity was so fierce that the British sappers were not able to bridge the river that night. But fortunately, the Germans failed to capitalize upon their successes, and the bridgehead held during the next day. One brigade of the division had lost 35 out of their 40 boats as a result of bombardment, but by contrast, in 8th Division's area, better progress was made, and at least 2 bridges were across by 0900. The engineer plan was impressive. In 4th Division's area, 3 bridges were to be built, and these were codenamed Amazon, Blackwater and Congo. The initial progress on all sites was good, with work starting almost as soon as the first wave of assault boats was across the river. But the heavy fire from the German positions damaged many supply trucks and caused havoc on the building sites. Instead of me telling you the story of what happened on the bridge build that night, let us hear the story from 2 people who were there. Firstly, Sergeant Jack Stamper. Jack, tell me, what were conditions like, and what was the morale of the boys like at the time of the bridge build?
Well, I think the morale was very, very good, because we'd done a lot of training on the Volturno. Major Lowe put us through our paces. He made us do it over and over again, knocking time off. Of course, conditions weren't the same. We didn't have the harassment of the enemy, and the river wasn't as bad as what the Volturno was. But an illustration of what the morale of the lads were was that after we'd gone to the Congo site, after it had been aborted, Major Lowe called an old group of all officers and senior NCOs, told us what was in store, and he said that if any of your men are not up to it, they can go to B echelon. I want every man to be perfectly up to it. And in my particular section, I had 2 men who'd had pretty bad experiences, and I didn't think they were up to it, and I gave them the opportunity of going to B echelon, and they were quite mad about it. No, we're going on the site, we're coming with you, and that was it. That was the morale.
Now, Jack, the time came when you had to build the Congo Bridge. Can you tell me what conditions were like that night?
Yes, we assembled and went down to the site. Previously we'd lifted a lot of shoe mines from the bridge approaches. We'd been on that job for probably a fortnight before, and when we got down to the to the river, the smoke had thickened up and there was a thick, heavy river mist, and we were all taped together so that we all got down to the site in one party. And I think we got one bridging lorry unloaded, and then the enemy started shelling, and the shelling was so intense we were virtually driven off the bridge site, and Major Lowe gave the order to evacuate the site, which I think was perfectly correct, because we'd have lost lost a considerable number of people if we'd stayed there. It was probably the worst shelling I ever experienced during the war.
But there was still a need for another bridge, wasn't there, to go across?
Definitely. When we went back to our concentration area where we'd dug in, and the following day Major Lowe called this whole group, and he said that the Army had ordered that a bridge must be built at all costs, and the 225, 7th and 59 field companies who made up the 4th Divisional Engineers should form up in one party of what was left of them, and drew lots for who should start the job, which the 225 started. And when we got down there, the first person I saw was the CRE, Colonel Nelson, and his coat, he got his greatcoat on, and it was just as though somebody had thrown a bucket of red lead at it, where he'd been carrying wounded out.
And then the bridge build started, did it, for on the Amazon side?
Yes, Lieutenant Hobson, he was situated in a slit trench near the river with a radio, and he was in contact with the bridging lorries and bringing them down by radio one at a time. And I believe we'd got probably one or two lorries unloaded, and for some reason, which I don't recollect what I had to do, I had to go back up to where the lorries were, and on the way back there was a brilliant blue flash appeared at my right hand side, quite close. I never heard anything. Of course there was a lot of noise, so it probably deafened the noise of the explosion or whatever it was that struck. But my first impression was that I'd trod on a shoe mine that hadn't been lifted. And I was very relieved to find that my foot was intact, so it wasn't a shoe mine. But I felt suddenly pain in my shoulder and in my buttocks. And then I went stiff. I just seemed to be paralysed, and a couple of the chaps took me to the regimental aid post, and that was all I can remember about it. I was evacuated from the site.
Joe Gilliard, who was a sapper at the time, was on the site for the building of both the Congo and the Amazon bridges. Now, Joe, tell me, what were conditions like, and how did the boys feel?
Well, same as I've always said, I think the men, the state of the men, I reckon you get 1% contemplating suicide, you know. And you've took something like 2% going to injure themselves before they go. And then there's others what can't stand it. You know, they go bomb happy, same as one chap with us, he started screaming, you know.
Were they all
Terrible
volunteers?
days.
Were they volunteers for the bridge?
No, they weren't volunteers, but... No, there wasn't volunteers. I didn't volunteer for it, but you see, we wouldn't miss it.
Right.
We wouldn't have missed it.
So when you went to build the bridge, Joe, I imagine there must have been much enemy activity at the time. Can you tell us about this?
Well, the most vivid memory is of this acrid smell of cordite. You know, there were 1,000 guns firing, of cordite and smoke, the combination. And it was terribly, it was difficult breathing at times. A lot of the time it wasn't so bad, but other times it was enough to knock you out.
And what about enemy fire?
Well, there's plenty of that. There's a Spandau firing periodically, you know, and but twice tracer bullets were coming through the bridge.
Now, you were a sapper at the time, Joe.
I was a sapper, yes.
And who was in charge of your party?
Well, Sergeant Riordan was in charge originally, and he'd be on the bridge, but I can't remember anything about him or anybody else giving orders. We just carried on carrying these panels up. When they was ready, we just went and carried another one up.
So you didn't need anybody to be in charge, really?
No. I suppose somebody would be in charge, like, but I can't remember who it was. It could have been Corporal Smiles or Lance Corporal Jackson, who were there.
But it was tremendous teamwork.
Oh, it was. We did have to a fine art, you know. Reading it took so long, we had so many stoppages and whatnot when we ran that time, when Germans were coming across the river.
What do you mean, ran?
Well, somebody said the rumour swept round the site that the Germans were coming across. So everybody down told and we ran for 3/4 of a mile. And I've told my son here many a time, that one officer who was there, he got that bridge up on his own, because they would never have gone back if it hadn't been for him.
Well, you were hauled back to the bridge, were you?
Oh, aye. We were reprimanded.
And then had to get on with it again.
Well, we just carried on as normal then when this chap got us back down.
For those of you who have built a Bailey bridge, you will know that we have to jack the bridge down on the far bank. But in this case,
there wasn't time to do this. Joe, can you tell us about this?
Well, for a start, they had a bulldozer pushing the bridge across. Every now and again, you know, put so many panels on and push a bit more across. And there was 2 bulldozers, I think, they were both knocked out. And then to finish up, they had this first tank that came on the side. They got that to push it across. And there's nobody could get across to the other side, you see. There's no chance of jacking it down, so they just pushed it off the rollers and dropped it on the far bank. And they used it like that.
And how long did the build take, Joe?
Well, I estimate we started at 10 o'clock at night and we finished at 5 in the morning.
And a great sigh of relief went up then, presumably, when you did that.
Yeah. It's a sigh of relief. It was a great job.
But your preparation was as much as you could have done, do you think?
Couldn't have done better. Major Lowe, well, he was the best major we had on the whole time I was abroad. And we were building it, and the drivers were pulling it down. And he got the driver, it's the first time I've ever known the drivers work. And there was a big hullabaloo going on. They weren't going to maintain the lorries no more and all these things.
Right, I'll bet.
And we built it, and they took it down and stacked it. And then in the afternoon we built it again, and they took it down again. And we built it twice a day, you know, for about 2 days, maybe 3.
Well, it was obviously a great day, Joe, when that bridge was built.
It was fantastic. I wouldn't have missed it.
And so the bottleneck at Cassino was passed after months of fighting. The Germans had always considered the fortress to be impregnable. But once the Allies had crossed the river Rapido and bypassed the monastery, the advance to Rome was rapid. After the war, the monastery was rebuilt to its former glory, and it can be seen looking like this today. Many lessons were learnt from this campaign, and you will have drawn your own conclusions from the film you have just seen. But perhaps one point does need emphasis, and that was the determination and the enthusiasm of the sapper, without whom the crossing would not have been possible.